Hello, and today I'm going to rant a bit about tier lists. So tier lists are those kind of things that you hear when someone says that something is good or bad, or it is high tier or low tier, which is commonly used to describe things in fighting games like Smash or Street Fighter or whatever it is. Characters will be referred to as high tier, mid tier, low tier, whatever it is. Some games have like letters, numbers, whatever it is. Now, the idea of tier lists in Splatoon have been around for quite some time, and it usually has changed based on, when nerfs and buffs have come out to weapons. But can there truly be tier lists for this game? Now, the thing is, I actually don't believe that there can be solid tier lists when it comes to Splatoon, mostly because typical games with tier lists are fighting games, games where it is a one-on-one, but Splatoon is a 4v4. So where some weapons that people may consider being low tier or high tier are mostly just because of their ability to use it or how easily versatile the weapon is. Like, it is very common that people will classify the 10 attack as high tier, or at least like mid to high tier, because of how easily placed it can be on a team. While weapons like the ink brush are just going to obviously be low tier because they require, some form of like learning curve, and it's not easily placed into a team comp, and so weapons like that are placed very low, while weapons obviously like the E-Leader and 10 attack are going to be placed pretty high. But the thing is, the game is in fact a 4v4, and tier lists would have to account for the fact that not everything is going to be a 1v1 situation, where one weapon may be considered very good, but it's not going to be very good against everything, or it might not be good on certain maps and certain modes. So it's very weird how tier lists in this game would work, and yet very few people actually seem to understand it. There was somebody on Reddit, I believe it was, that tried to create a tier list based on the consensus of everyone that used r/Splatoon. But most of the time when it comes to people making tier lists, it tends to be opinion based, when typical tier lists are usually, I guess, information gathered from multiple people rather than just one person's opinion becoming like the general tier list. And it's not going to stop people from, obviously top players are going to be making their tier lists, and then it's going to be like everything you'd expect. So everything like high tier, you're gonna see your 10 attacks, your 52 gals, your E-Leaders, your Lunas, whatever, and then anything else that you wouldn't commonly see is going to be all considered trash, just because they don't see it, or they don't like it, or they just don't care. And that's a little unfair to other weapons, because some weapons can be more useful than others in certain situations based on the map and mode. So basically what I'm getting at here is I don't believe that tier lists, at least at this point, should have to exist, because most people don't take in these other things into account. Where some weapons, can be considered high tier, but it's not going to be they're not going to be easily placed into a comp, and it's not going to just flow as easy in certain maps and modes. Like, say, the 96 Deco at one point was considered a high tier weapon, but now, because of nerfs to the splash wall and its damage, people don't consider it as high tier. But imagine back in the day when this was considered high tier, and you had to play a map like Flounder Heights, where that top point where you're on the roofs, it's not exactly a very ideal situation for the 96, because you would want to play from your range, and those parts are so close quarters that it's, you're not obviously gonna not have that opportunity, and where the 96 would shine would mostly be down in the enemy streets. So it would be, the 96 would be considered high tier, but it would be considered low to mid tier for that map. So if you guys understand what I'm getting at here, where tier lists are mostly right now based on opinion and just a general broad consensus of how the weapon is, rather than how it can be applied into maps and modes. So these weapons can be considered good, but then they could still be considered bad for modes or maps. So something like, let's as an example, people generally say Dynamo is good, but the Dynamo isn't exactly the champion when it comes to breaking the Rainmaker shield. So, say in a tier list for Splat zones, I have Dynamo up there because it can paint very well, but it's like maybe mid-tier for Rainmaker because it can't pop the shield and can't really assist the team doing that, unless you're using the sub weapon, of course. But I'm just talking about the main weapon here. And then it's like mid to high tier on tower control because tower control is really weird, and the Dynamo can flick, and it can sometimes not kill somebody on the tower or could demolish everyone on the tower. But then let's take into an account the maps. So very, very close quarter maps, like a skate park, is considered a decent Dynamo map. So you could say that is mid to high tier on Black Belly Skate Park. And then say Black Belly Skate Park Rainmaker, it could be mid to low tier, in fact, because of how close quarters the map is, and then putting it in a mode where the Dynamo isn't exactly going to shine to begin with. So basically what I'm trying to say is that tier lists now need to change and not need to be this the same way that fighting games handle them. Weapons need to be looked at in the way that they can be used in everything, and how easily placed they can be for modes, maps, and just in general. And in fact, maybe their tier list should just be comps. Because the game is 4v4, you make a team that's all high tier weapons, but it's like, okay, it's a good comp. That's fine. Like 2 10 attacks, a E-leader, and a blaster of any form would probably be a decent comp. But there needs to be like a tier list for team comps because it is a 4v4 and not a 1v1. That's like, to make a tier list with individual weapons standing alone would be like assuming that everything is going to be a 1v1 and you'll never ever encounter having to fight more than one person at a time. So say something like a 52 gal is commonly placed as high tier, but you wouldn't exactly have the easiest time in a 1v2 as the 52 gal, where one person's in front of you and one's behind you. The most common reaction is for a 52 to throw a splash wall and stand behind it, but then if you get sandwiched, then you're probably going to lose. Now, that can be said about any weapon, but I'm just trying to point out that there is a fault with having tier lists being based and assume that everything is a 1v1, where the tier list should evolve to reflect how the game functions, and shouldn't be on a one-to-one basis on how things are going to work in the broadest sense, but instead should come back and go into this whole thing where tier lists should exist as more of an opinion piece and then be separated by map and mode, just so these points can get across a bit more. These, like, people actually in Smash Bros, you'll hear sometimes that characters are good on these maps, but not so good. Like, they can capitalize on low blast zones or whatever, like all that stuff. You'll hear that a lot of times in Smash, is where they'll say like, "Oh, this character is good because they can, there's a low ceiling and they can take advantage of that." But in maps with higher ceilings, then they have to change up how they can, get the stock off. So that's, they commonly bring that up, where characters based on map can have their own individual tiers. And I think that Splatoon should also include that, where people make these tier lists and include the individual maps and modes to reflect how different the game is from, Smash and Street Fighter, where everything is a 1v1, or I guess a 2v2 if you're, playing doubles. But my point is that I think tier lists should exist and shouldn't at the same time. They shouldn't exist in the way they are now, but they should in a way that isn't in just the most broad sense, where you're just going to say that everything is good because you think it's good. You should look into how weapons are played on each map and how they can benefit from the map and mode, and how they can be hindered by the map and mode, and make a tier list on that. And then I guess the whole opinion thing is fine, but I don't know. I'm just thinking that maybe tier lists should have a bit more thought put into it, rather than just saying that this weapon is high tier because it gets played the most and it's easy. So, thank you all for watching, and I will see you all later.